film historian holding a PhD from University of Chicago. She's the author of Bengali Cinema, Another Nation, and has curated Flashback, 175 Years of Entertainment for the Times of India. She's the editor of the journal South Asian History and Culture and the South Asian History and Culture book series. Her recent book is Manoka Has Hanged Herself. Kanchana Banerjee has been writing for almost 20 years. She began her career with The Statesman and then worked with the Times of India. She has written for numerous reputed publications in the country and has worked with various MNCs and PR firms as a corporate writer. In 2011, she founded an online company called WriteWord and conducted online writing courses to help women learn the art of freelance writing. Nobody's Child, a dark and twisted thriller, is her second book with HarperCollins, and her first novel, A Forgotten Affair, was published in September 2016. Shabana Roy, a civil engineer by profession, finds himself equally comfortable in both fiction and technical writing. A writer of 5 best-selling fictional books and 9 technical papers, Roy presents a unique blend of authorship. He is a person who is deeply driven by a passion to explore the multidisciplinary secrets of life in a unified manner. Shabana is presently working on his 6th book, a storybook with ideas as its characters to understand the certainty of uncertainty in human life. Our panelists today will be in conversation with Shukarna Das, a member of Team Game Plan who's rarely seen without a book in her hand. So ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our panelists up on stage with a huge round of applause.
So I'm going to start. That dog in that picture, he is also a star. He smiled at her. Like you, Rajbala. Do you want to be a star like him, like that little dog? Raju tossed in her slumber and twitched. She was in the old house with the statues and marble floors, those wooden stairs, the pictures on the walls. One of them had a man wearing nothing cutting the throat of a little girl, a girl with golden hair. Had he cut off more heads, like Ma Kali? Were they real, that man and that girl, from somewhere far off? He had seen her looking. You like that painting? My father had bought it. He was like that man. She hadn't known what he had meant. He had shown her some photographs from bioscope pictures made in America. In the dark library room, the pictures making blocks of brightness as he had held the oil lamp over them. He hadn't switched on any lights, only the 2 big oil lamps carried in by that man who would open the door to her. The man who never looked at her. Raju sat up in her bed, her throat dry. She ran her tongue on the roof of her mouth. The water-filled earthen pitcher was by the side of her bed. Could she get to it? Might not she get pulled into some dark underworld if she so much as put a foot out of bed? Crocodiles crawling below her in the dark, waiting to bite off her 2 feet if they hazarded their way out of her bed. When she had gotten back from the old house, it was the dead of night. She had heard the church clock strike the chime of 1 as she was stepping into the car. His car that would get her back every time. Now her visits were closer, more often than before. He would send for her through his man, Asghar, the driver who came sometimes even as she was finishing her evening's meal and waited as she got quickly dressed. Like the man who would open the door in the old house, Asghar never spoke to her. She knew his name because Sahib had called out to him one time, Asghar, for him to take her back. Sahib would always be in the corner room upstairs, the room with the big bed where she had first sat. Sometimes he wouldn't speak or even look her way as she would creep in and climb onto the bed, like on the first night. Somehow she had known it to be her place. Sahib had a way of telling her things without saying them. She understood from the way he looked at something or leaned back in his chair, like he was speaking to her through his arms and feet and those eyes. And there were some things. A long lock of hair laid on the pillow. Whose was it? She hadn't seen any woman ever in that place. It had to be a woman's. And then the jasmine garland laid on the bedside. It was for her. She had known it. Though she hadn't touched it, it had lain there, awaiting her, buds half open like Sahib's watching eyes. She would feel his eyes on her, even as she would look away.
Monty, then, 2017. As we walked down the corridor together, I knew there would be questions. She saw the peeling paints on the wall, the small dark rooms, and the windows with grills, the large doors with a heavy, chunky lock on them. Why are there grills on the windows? Even the balconies have grills. And the doors, why do they have such big locks? Why? The answer lurked in her eyes as she asked, terrified that what she was suspecting might be true, but she hung on to the hope that maybe she was wrong. So that the girls don't climb out and escape. I didn't tell her that. Instead, I said something about pigeons being a menace. She didn't buy it. I had been told by Bhai not to say anything to her. I know you like her, Monty. I have seen you sitting glued to the TV during the entire contest for months. Keep your mouth shut. I knew better than to disobey. It had been 3 months since Asavri had arrived at the house. She was fine by now, and the doctors had said. Can I go home now? She asked, trying to sound cheerful, but I sensed fear in her voice. Bhai was also in the room. She moved to a spot behind the large hospital bed, trying to keep some space. She stood near the headboard, drumming her fingers on it, trying to smile, but I could see her gulp down her saliva and lick her lips. She used to do the same thing during the contest when the names of the eliminated participants were being announced. I knew her signs well. I wanted to hold her hand and tell her that she'd be fine, but I couldn't. Bhai would never allow it. It's against the house rules. And she won't be fine. Girls in the house never are. Her eyes searched for me. I could feel them on me. I looked at my mobile. I couldn't look at her. Of course you can go home, Bhai replied in that soothing, reassuring tone of his, the true intent behind which I knew. It was common knowledge in the house. He was the nicest just before things got worse. But first, let's thank the kind doctors and the nurses who took such good care of you, shall we? She didn't understand what he meant, but nodded her head and said, Can I make a call? They must be worried about me, at Mumbai. Asavri, don't. Please stop talking. I wanted to tell her, but I couldn't disobey Bhai. When it happened, she couldn't stop throwing up, retching, crying, and then throwing up again. She shut her eyes tight, as though she wanted to unsee what she just had. I wanted to hold her when Shashi fired the first bullet. The doctor wasn't expecting it either. Asavri gasped and then stood frozen, unable to believe what she had just seen. It's never easy to see brains being blown out of the skull. The sound is so loud, and the sight, the red splatter, is incredibly messy. Blood, bits of brain everywhere. Sometimes you discover a tiny bit clinging to a crack on the wall or under a chip tile days later, even weeks later. The first one to get hit doesn't really expect it, even if the gun is held to their head. They believe that the person holding the gun would change their mind. When the trigger is pulled, the bullet shoots out and hits the skull with a loud twang, awfully loud noise. The body jumps in recoil and then falls on the ground, the look of horror frozen on the face. Bhai doesn't like bullets. He prefers poison. There's more drama to it, But every once in a while, he uses the bullet just for the big bang, or when he's in a hurry, just wants to get over with it. That day, he had an appointment with the barber to trim his beard.
Chapter 2 of intermediate, incomplete conversation set pieces from my 5th book. It was a long conversation once again, but on the phone. Dr. X. Good evening, Mr. Y. How are you doing? I. I'm doing fine. But how is it that you have my phone number? I never gave it to you. Dr. X. You must have the will to get something. You will get it thus. I. That's all right. But where did you get my phone number? Dr. X. I got it from a common source, but that's not the point. My apologies for not being at home when you visited my place to pay back my money. I was busy with some other assignments. I. Yes, I have been visiting your house regularly for the last 7 days, but to no avail. I also worried whether you had shown me the correct house. So, when should I come back to return your money? Please understand that's important to me. I do not want to carry on with a debt unnecessarily. Dr. X. Mr. Y, you are a man of fine character. I will let you know the time in due course when I'll be at home to receive you. I have a few queries to make about you. Do you mind? I. Well, it depends on your nature of questioning. Dr. X. Should I go ahead with my questions? I. Please do. Dr. X. Why did you stop writing poetry at such an early age? I had to take care of my wife. Dr. X. Even Eliot took care of his wife, yet he wrote such brilliant poetry. I'm a brilliant and highly innovative insurance agent. Eliot was a mere bank clerk. How good he was at his job, I'm not so sure. Dr. X. Is it good enough to tell me that your muse dried up just because you were taking care of your wife? I. The reality shows something else. Dr. X, please carry on. I. As I got gradually involved with my wife, I got disconnected from my life, completely disconnected from my life. Apart from the sordid world of nursing an ill body, I knew nothing. I sweated day and night. I worried day and night about an ill body. Dr. X. You attempted to kill her once? I. No, not at all. Dr. X. Of course you attempted to kill her once by suffocating her under a bunch of pillows on her bed. You suffocated her so badly that she was in hospital for the next 3 days. I. You have distorted the truth. The truth is, she attempted to kill herself by strangulation, but she failed in physical strength. Dr. X. But you wanted to see her dead, all right? I. Are you interrogating me? What right do you have to interrogate me? Dr. X. Mr. Y, be prudent enough. You feel good when you talk to me. Don't disconnect the line out of feigned disgust. I'm not disconnecting the line. You must understand, Dr. X, taking care of an ill woman in her youth is a dirty business. It takes away your innocence. It makes you an implicit criminal. It makes you what you are not. Dr. X, that's not true. What's not true? Dr. X, even under normal circumstances, people wish others' death just to remove their perceived obfuscations. Give me an example. Dr. X, should I give an example from your life? Like? Dr. X, like you wished your mother's death when she fell in love with one of your uncles. Is it not true? You had screamed at her one night? Dr. X, you are crossing your limit. I owe you some money, but that doesn't mean you can tell me whatever you want. Dr. X, Mr. Y, I want to be a friend of yours. Do accept my invitation for dinner tomorrow night at my place. Please reach by 7 p.m. Wear your most comfortable attire. There is no dress code at my place. And please bring the money with you that you owe me. Believe me, I will offer you the most delicious multi-cuisine buffet you have eaten in a long time. I will not disappoint you, Dr. X. I'll come certainly. I accept your invitation.
The sets of a movie studio way back in 1937. The sets of a reality TV show, maybe set about today, 2-3 years before. And any day and every day with your friendly neighborhood, not Spider-Man, but Dr. Man, or just your not so friendly neighborhood neighbor. Crime. Where do we think it happens? Which would be the most likely setting of the three that we just heard read out by authors who talk of the dark side of the mind? Sharmishta's book, Menoka Hanged Herself, is set in the backdrop of a movie studio in 1937. Kanchana's book is about a reality TV show and what happens behind the scenes, not so scripted. Shaburno has written a lot of books. The one that I've read is about a family drama woven through a family business. The one that he's talking about is much more chilling. It's, like I said, about your not so friendly neighbor. A question that I would like to ask our panelists is, where then does crime occur? Where does crime happen? What is the inception point of crime, would you think? Sharmishta first.
Yes, obviously, I mean, crime, in my mind, crime happens in the mind. And in my book, which is called Menoka Has Hanged Herself, Menoka is a heroine of this studio called Bharat Talkies. This book is set in 1937. And the book opens on the night of the New Year, 1937, when everyone is partying. And Menoka goes to the studio and she hangs herself by her own sari. So Menoka has hanged herself. Nobody actually hangs her, she hangs herself. And that's because she's been driven to it, because of the mind games that have happened. So crime is actually happening in the mind. Someone has played these mind games with her, pushed her against the wall so hard that she goes to the studio and hangs herself. So in my mind, there are all kinds of crime, obviously, and but a lot of the very intelligent crimes happen in the mind. And so this book is about how these girls in the studio para, in the Kolkata studio para, they were being pushed, against the wall. They were pushed to actually, and where one of them actually goes and hangs herself. So crime is about manipulation, it's about mind games, it's about sexual exploitation.
Kanchana?
Hello, everybody. I think there couldn't be a more paradoxical place to talk about crime than this. It's such a beautiful architectural wonder, and we're talking about crime. Yes, of course, crime first starts with the intent of the person. My book, Nobody's Child, this is the book, Nobody's Child. It is set against the backdrop of a reality TV music show like Indian Idol. In the book, it is called Indian Koel. And the backdrop is actually a very small part of the story. The story focuses mainly on the villain of the story, who's a woman. Her name is Kamini Pratap Singh, and the character of Kamini has been inspired by a very well-known woman from our society. I don't want to take any names, but allegedly she sat in the back seat of her car as her first husband killed her daughter by the second husband by strangulating her as she sat in the rear seat of the car. I think all of you know who I'm talking about. She and her very high-profile husband are now in jail. So so Kamini has been Kamini's character is inspired by that lady from our society, and it is about and the story Nobody's Child is really about Kamini's aspirations to get ahead in life at any cost. And the protagonist, her name is Asavri. She's a singer from a very small town in West Bengal, and she comes to Bombay to realize her dreams. And willy-nilly her paths cross with Kamini, and Kamini has her own cunning plans, and and in that Asavri is a very big hurdle. So the story Nobody's Child is about this young girl who's trying to find her identity and just to make a simple living for herself. But her path crosses with the evil plans of Kamini, and how different people at different points in her life kind of, come with an agenda of their own and play evil games just to get ahead. So yeah, I think, crime first happens in the mind, and I think evil, whether it is born or it is nurtured, that's a separate discussion. But I think, some people just have a completely skewed moral compass, and, and for them, their own gain is what matters. That's what this book abounds in, different characters who just want to get ahead, and how Asavri tackles all of them. Does she die in the end? Does she survive? Does she come out of it? That's what you have to find out by reading the book. Thank you.
Shaburno?
You have asked a very generic question, where does crime start? More scientifically speaking, I think it starts within your nervous system. There could be genetic reasons, there could be social circumstances leading to a crime, but crime essentially is overarching of greed and lust. But then there are different kinds of crimes. Now, one-time crime reasons could be one type, and like all of us here must have watched Mindhunter on Netflix, and you know that in 1970s, early 1970s, FBI was extremely bothered with the phenomenon of serial killing. And they came out with a lot of scientific reasons why serial killing happens, and in fact, they could nab some of the upcoming serial killings, having studied the past serial killers. So it would be very complex to say in one sentence where crime starts from, but definitely mind is a factor, but more scientifically speaking, it's the nervous system which also constitutes your brain. And Mindhunter comes to my mind, and there could be a single incident of a crime. There are many stories of that. In my book, Abyss, this is my 5th book. This contains certain criminal subplots, but Abyss is a literary situational crime thriller with a lot of political and ethical questions of issues of the day. And these are to do with a lot of other issues. It's a single crime, but it's a complex crime to do with inheritance and other issues. Yeah, that's it.
I will take forward from one thing that you said, and I think Kanchana also wants to take on from there, but about how crimes, start off scientifically speaking or technically speaking from the nervous system and are primarily from greed and lust. We hear these words bandied about: psychopath, sociopath. Do we know that the definition of psychopath is actually someone who is without conscience? Absence of conscience, right? Serial killers, whatever, however that manifests itself, may not manifest itself in violent crime, can just manifest itself in gaslighting and causing, many Menokas to hang themselves. So psychopathy is defined as the absence of conscience. And till date, psychologists or the mental health universe doesn't really know how to treat that, because that is not a medical problem. So psychopathy is treated or addressed by treating or teaching the victims of psychopathy to adapt and change. So crime, one would say, probably begins with a total lack of conscience at one end of the spectrum, and at other ends, where I'm sure all of us are, with a little tweaking of our conscience here and a little tweaking there and a little adjustment there and a little adjustment there. What do you feel about this, Kanchana? I'll come to you after this, because you had something to say as well.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of bring in a topic here, a discussion here, that there is always this tussle between what is it that contributes to evil? Is it is it something that happens in their psychosis, a lack of consciousness, or is it the circumstances which contribute to it? Now, to just to cite an example from my book, Kamini Pratap Singh, who is the principal antagonist of the book, she is from a very, very small and a poor family living in Benares. She's been completely neglected by her father. She's grown up without her mother. Her mother passed away long back. And, and she has been left day after day by her father, who went out to work in the care of a woman who lived above their ground floor house, who herself was a degenerate. So suppose if women like Kamini kind of lived in a loving, nurturing family, would she be different? Like, say, for example, the Menakas, they were a product of the society and the bullying that happened. So suppose if, if those things did not happen, would they be different? So, it's very interesting that you brought up Mindhunter, because I watched a number of episodes in that. As far as I know, I may be wrong in this, most psychopaths, most abusers, most evil serial killers, they come from very disturbed families. I don't think there is a serial killer who's come from a very loving, caring family. So I think it's a topic of very big debate. So I would like to, throw it up. I mean, any of you have any views to share on this? Do you think evil comes out of circumstances, or it's born? What do you think?
Yeah, I have strong opinions about that evil is absence of good. It's not black and white, of course, and lack of conscience in the sense of dark side of the mind, as we are talking here, I do not think it fits in the bill completely. You see, when it has been scientifically proven that when people do not see reason, they are prone to violence, whether they will commit or physically execute a crime or not. That is something not deterministic. They may not. But I think the lack of reason is very important. And if you see the rehabilitation models, especially in Europe and the US, of very hardcore criminals, what they try to set in among the criminals is an ability to reason with the present circumstances. But with the Genome Project, I must tell you this, that with the genetic project now complete by 2010, there are certain things which we will not be able to correct, even if we have the best of families, even if we have the best of circumstances, because there is a genetic trait in everything, like having cancer, and similarly with a high probability of physically executing a crime. So physical circumstances would not limit everything what genetics throw to us as legacy through our parental inheritance.
Very interesting point indeed, but I'll jump from that to the other end of the slider. Everything is on a slider. Absence of conscience to, like I said, tweakings. From what you said, being born with a certain genetic imprint or information which kind of pushes us a little bit more towards maybe the recklessness that makes crime easier. Or again, those tweakings of conscience. My question at this point would be, how many of us right here are capable of violent crime? One. It's just a question to think about. It's definitely not a question where we go, hey, I am capable of doing this. Not that at all. But my question as a reader and to you as writers is, also to you as readers, is how much of that finds vent in reading thrillers, gorier the better, and or thrillers as subtle as, whether that's on AV or whether that's reading, as subtle as a mind hunter. Do you think that that's also another reason for the popularity of thrillers, not just the chase being described, the plot being described, the final climax where you catch the criminal or you kind of figure out who it is, Dr. X or Mr. Y or whoever, but the fact, the machinations of of the mind, and whether we could actually veer towards that or not ourselves.
Reading and even maybe writing, do you think?
Yes, totally.
Do you think
I'm
people
glad you said that.
write the most gory thrillers could actually do it in real life?
I don't know.
Do you think that?
I don't know. I think I could, probably. Not
Yeah,
right, but absolutely commit a gory murder.
Yeah. Can I say something?
yes.
Go ahead.
Your question was, just can you repeat?
My question was, this pull of thrillers, this pull of books.
I got
How
the
much of
thread
it is
now.
venting
You see,
of the dark side of the mind?
In the dark side of the mind, whenever we talk of dark literature, I think we will have to look at two broad divisions. One is the thrillers that also titillate the audience with an artificial sense of thrill and suspense, and the other variety is literary criminal drama. All right, like Mindhunter is literary criminal drama. It's not a thriller. All right, so a Bond film is a thriller, but when you see Skyfall, at some point in time, you feel that somewhere Sam Mendes is just crossing the line to a literary criminal drama. So it's not a pure Bond film. Skyfall doesn't come out as a pure Bond film. It's an impure Bond film. So what I'm trying to say is that these two variations have to be made, and I per se am more interested in literary criminal drama than thrillers, because thrillers beyond a point escalate you to a sense of a dosage which by every passing day you need more and more, and beyond a point it doesn't work on you.
Also, we can't all be Bond.
I just want to say, I think, evil fascinates all of us. Because I think more than evil, it is something which is dark, which is unknown, which is complex. Evil is fascinating because all of us are, by society, by our parenting, by everything that we are exposed to, we are taught to be correct, we are taught to be right. We don't, we are told not to hurt anyone. But I think there is evil, or there is a dark side in all of us, and we kind of vicariously live it by reading these dark films, dark TV, dark books, writing them maybe also, because evil is something which is so complex, which kind of boggles our mind. And just to give a very, very plain example, my first book is a relationship drama. It sold well, but Nobody's Child is a dark, violent thriller, and it's selling so well. So I guess thriller, because it just kind of catches people's fancy, because it's unknown, it's complex.
Evil is seductive.
No, can I give you two examples? Oh yeah.
She wants to say something.
So yes, I'm just going to add to what they said, that yes, I do believe, and I think I got this really, a lot of it out of Agatha Christie, which she always says that evil is in everybody. It's an everyday thing. How many times have so many of us overlooked something which we actually did see, and it was, that evil in us which made us overlook. Why? Children. I have a 5-year-old. And I have, observed children around me. Children are capable of such cruelty sometimes, cruelty to animals, cruelty to other children. And, I was listening to what you were saying, and sometimes it's wired inside. Not all of us end up, doing murders, or not all of us end up being serial killers. But for some of us, I think it's wired in here, because my book, it's about this person who is he is a psychopath in the making, and I'm going to write a sequel where he becomes, a full-blown one. And So it ends with the line, the book ends with the line that, you know, he's now going to visit his father and he says, I'm my father's son, I'm like my baba. So basically, you know, he's wired, you know, because he came out, you know, he is the product of incest. He was created in such a way that he is wired and his father is evil, so he has turned out evil. So I do agree with you that sometimes some people are really wired and nothing can correct it. But also evil is an everyday thing and it is in all of us.
Yeah,
something.
I'll give you an example. Very recently, I was talking about this from real life. Now, Picasso painted Guernica, all right? And he was one of the greatest he rigged and created an art cartel to increase and enhance the price of his own paintings. So Picasso painted Guernica in 1936 and communists go gaga over Picasso because of that painting, and they don't like listening to the stories of Picasso that he ran a cartel of art dealers in Paris. So this is quite contrary to the same man who could stand up to the establishment is also a part of the establishment somewhere. And from fiction, let me tell you, non-crime fiction, Lolita, all right? Nabokov actually seduces with a lot of things which we understand today in great detail. Lolita at the age of 14 practically and factually seduces Humbert Humbert. All right? And Humbert Humbert is also in love with Lolita. And they have consensual sex. And Lolita takes revenge on Humbert Humbert by having a child at the age of 16 from another lover. So the romantic idea of child molestation, pedophilia has to be relooked, you know. Because a lot of people in our age equate pedophilia with child molestation. Actually, child molestation is very different from pedophilia. Pedophilia is something when you are in love with a girl who has not reached puberty till the age of 13. Similarly, there is infantophilia. So our lack of innocence also plays while understanding what is evil and what is not evil. And we use words, you know, very loosely.
Do any of you want to say anything to that? If not, I will have to say something here, because that is a troubling there's a set of troubling statements there which is beyond the scope of this panel to take on. But pedophilia, if I understand correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, or any philia for that matter, is my interest in something, not necessarily that person's interest in me or that object's interest in me, number one. And hence, there is no question of pedophilia being confused with child molestation, because molestation, by definition, cannot be consensual, number two. Number three, while Lolita is a literary masterpiece, I mean, there's no question about that. But at 14, you are not equipped to have consensual sex. It may be lack of my information, it may be my gender, it may be because, you know, I've walked the roads so many women share that, you know, you walk the roads when you're 11 years old and wearing a blue frock with lace and somebody, you know, just feels it's okay to grope you. I'm sorry, at 14, I am incapable of seducing, as is any other, 14-year-old child. But of course, as an object, interest, sexual interest, of course, pedophilia exists. What evil enters into it when I choose to act on it, or whether I don't. I mean, I'm sorry if I
I think I fully agree with what you are saying. I'm completely with you what you are saying, except for the fact that if we look into the reality of Lolita as a novel, I'm talking within the perspective of Lolita as a novel. I'm not saying that the same thing would be applicable elsewhere. You see, at one point, if you say that what Lolita does is surreal, I'm agreeable to accept it. It's beyond reality. But within the novel, it happens thus.
No, it doesn't, because the novel is a narrative novel where the criminal, and I will use the word, the child abuser is the narrator. And that is precisely what I would think my reading of Nabokov's Lolita would be, the seduction of evil, where you normalize what's happening and you pin the blame on the victim. So I'm sorry, I am not equipped enough to. I think this is beyond the scope of this.
I think we are misunderstanding each other.
Not-
We can discuss it offline.
I think it is just a little too personal for me as a woman to, be able to take that statement. And also, I mean, that is the seduction of evil, sir, because, Nabokov is that genius who makes you feel that it's the perpetrator who's the poor man who's being seduced by this 14-year-old vixen. And that is precisely it. But
No. I must come here. I never feel that Humbert is a poor guy. Absolutely not. He is
Thank you for
he's a
that, sir.
perpetrator.
Thank
He's
you
a
for that.
perpetrator.
Yeah.
Of course he is.
We all are on edge. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Anything that Sharmishta and
not on this,
Kanchana? Not on this? Yeah. So, are we okay with throwing, but there is, what do I say? Let's just throw questions open to the audience. Do we have somebody with a mic? Let me hand one.
Good evening. My question is that in nowadays, thrillers are available in almost every media. Like you were talking about Mindhunter, Netflix series, or books. So while writing thrillers, don't you feel that crime fiction has almost reached a sort of a saturation point? Like readers or viewers, they don't kind of expect anything new. So how challenging is it for you as writers to deliver that kind of twist or that kind of thrill to engage the readers?
You're
Very
absolutely
interesting
right.
literary question.
Very interesting question. Yeah, you're absolutely right, because there is I think an overload of content in this genre across not just the visual medium but also in books. So I think that's when like as a writer one really needs to kind of think of innovative styles of narrative. Now, if you pick up my book, you will see that I have experimented with the narrative, and it's not just a simple telling in the third person tense. I've gone back and forth, tried to tell the story in a manner which grips you and which keeps you on the edge, and then try to delve into cold cases. Like for my third book, which is also a thriller, I have picked out an event that happened in the US in the 1970s, a mass suicide which happened in People's Temple with Jim Jones. So, the thing is that you really have to stretch your mind and go beyond and play with various themes. And I like to experiment with the narrative structure to make my storytelling more edgy and interesting. So that's how I try to.
I will talk a bit about what Chabourneau has written, some of his work that I've read. The styles are very different, all three. The styles are very different. If you pick up their books, you'll understand. So his books have this subtext of, it just kind of sends shivers down your spine. Even when it's a very normal, everyday scene that's being set, you just know there is that portent, that ominous evil is about to happen. So his is very subtle that way. Kanchana's last book is all out, and like she was telling us that there were questions about the fact that she as a woman wrote off such graphic violence. Sharmishta's book is again very in the mind, where she hangs herself because of things that happen to her, which are allowed to happen to her. So they have all kind of handled the thriller, but in very different literary styles, and very not just content but style of writing.
Can I just add? Well, I did not think of this, it turned out as a psychological thriller, but I did not think of it as a thriller when I started writing it. I'm actually a historian. of cinema. And this book has actually come out of the research that I have been doing for the last 15 years on Indian cinema, and the 1930s, 40s are my area of specialization. So when I was writing, I was actually not writing a thriller, but actually things that I discovered through my research, how what women would go through. Because at that time, two kinds of women would come into films. One, the very elite kind of women like Devika Rani, Sadhana Bose, who were from elite families, ladies of big families who would come to do art, but they were a handful. And the very large majority of women who came into films were of the performing or courtesan classes, basically, or poor girls who just landed up in the bioscope films, because the other option would have been to perform in a kotha or go into the sex work. So when you go through the archives, you actually get a sense, or I've spoken to people like Jamuna Devi, who was the first Parvati of Devdas in 1935, and when you talk to these women, you actually get a sense of what was happening. So I was actually writing from my research, and I was not actually thinking of it as a thriller, but as it turned out, it became a thriller, because the studio Para was like that. It was a dark place. There was an underbelly of sexual exploitation, beyond the glitz and the glamour and everything. And you just towed the line. If you came into that world, you just towed the line. What your director asked you to do, even outside the sets, you just did it.
And I'll give you a personal example of mine. I'm a film buff, all right? So, having watched a lot of Netflix stuff, I got bored one day. I really wanted to watch art house films, which has been my habit since my early teenage years. So I switched off to Mubi.com. And having switched over to Mubi.com, today I don't feel the urge to go back to Netflix. Okay? So you watch Michelangelo Antonioni, Francois Truffaut, and then you feel you are complete, you are fully satisfied with what you have watched. All right? And secondly, in my writing styles, in all my 4 books, apart from Winter Poems, I never, as Sukarna very rightly said, I never come very close to the crime scene. I write around the crime scene, just creating the idea of a crime. That's more important. That creates more chilling horror than the crime scene. So I think writing around the crime scene is also a subgenre within thrillers, I would say,
Any
which
other
I
question?
practice.
Any other questions?
There's a gentleman at the
Yes, please. Yeah, we'll take the questions. Mike?
Yeah, they say that to get a glimpse of the socio-political environment of a particular society, read the crime fiction coming out of that. Like Michael Connelly in US, or Joe Nesbo in Norway. So you get to know the socio-political environment of the writers. How do your novels are informed by the socio-political realities of what we are having in India?
Abyss, my full-fledged psychological thriller, it's a play in 2 acts, was first conceived in 2008, but actually written after the change of government in West Bengal, and because of the Shingur and Nondigram movement. And if one goes through the play, it has been enacted also. Very recently at JW Marriott, Telegraph was the media partner. And one can actually see an industrial empire thriving through the switch of power change in the federal structure where we exist. So it's a extremely Bengal or a Calcutta-based play. So definitely I think without a larger context of the socio-political scenario or the genetic matrix coming into the story, a thriller would be a cheap thriller, frankly speaking. It would be a cheap thriller. It would not excite the minds of serious readers. That's my view.
True. So my book, Nobody's Child, is basically based in Bombay, and where the reality TV happens and etc. So it is very, there are detailed descriptions of Bombay, its gully, and the atmosphere and the vibe of these reality TV contests that happen, and the kind of games that are played, cunning games that are played and schemed to kind of fluctuate the TRPs. Then the other part where the protagonist, when she's captured by this gang and she's kept in the house, it's deep inside Maharashtra in a small village, which is a fiction. The name is fictional. It doesn't really. So I've created the atmosphere of a very dirty, sordid place where the reader kind of feels the threat and the danger of the story and the characters, what happens. So, you're absolutely right. It's very, very important to create the setting and the socio-economic setting, and the characters need to come out of that setting and speak their language, which was actually quite a big challenge for me, because all the other characters are educated and they speak fluent English. Whereas in the house where the heroine is kept captive, these men are not well educated. They are very little educated, if not any. So they would be struggling with the language. So and then Kamini's childhood in Benares. I had the good opportunity of visiting Benares, and I was blown over by the city, the gullies, the Kachori Wali gully, and the wires hanging, and the cow and the filth. So it kind of it just stamped itself on my head, in my brain, and I just had to kind of make sure that Benares featured in some way or the other. So I think the setting is very, very important, and the society in which the story takes place. If that does not become a character by itself in the story, then the story loses its crux. It's very important.
Very correct.
So, as I was saying that, I did not start out to, write fiction. It was actually coming out of my research. So, it was very socio-political. It draws on research, and it was actually supposed to be the socio-political fictionalized. So, actually, people who know film history, or who are my friends who have, studied film history, they've actually asked me, oh, so is this character based on so-and-so from, film history? Have you drawn on so-and-so? So, I'm not going to comment on that in public. But I have obviously drawn on so-and-so character and then embellished it, and then, drawn from people I have observed around me. So, of course, my book is very socio-political of that time, and obviously it is also a commentary on what was happening to women, between men and women at that time in the film studios.
I think what they're all saying, and we all agree, is that there can be no content without context, right?
True.
Yeah. So we have time for one more question before we all head to hear Amitav Ghosh speak at the other venue. Do we have another question?
Hello. Okay, actually I wanted to ask, what should be the mindset of a reader when reading something like a crime thriller? Because most of the times, all of us, we are very much influenced by all the things that we study, our economical status, our background, all the things that we have learned so far. And then my question is, when reading a crime thriller or something of that type, should we completely switch off all the other things that are influencing us, like gender issues or the things that are considered moral or immoral? Because even when I was reading Porphyria's Lover of Robert Browning, the question was coming back to me, like, should I root for what Browning was giving us, or should I just impose my own critical judgment? So I think it's very disturbing for a reader, like as for me, which path to take. And I'm also going to address the modern TV series like Dexter or Mindhunter, because we get fascinated by all the ideologies that the unique minds, sort of in that way that we like to pose as criminal or very alienating to our own. Like, are we even justified to feel empathy for them? Should we root for them, or should we just try to read as a thriller? Thank you.
I think I think the most important thing is to first enjoy the book, to enjoy the story, and not get into whether you should morally support the villain or not. Like in my book, the main villainous character Kamini. Most of my readers, they have come back and told me that we find her deliciously evil. She's extremely evil. She commits the most heinous crimes in the novel, but there is some kind of a delightful hustle to her. So I think, it's important not to be judgmental when you're reading. Of course, you're free to kind of support one and not support the other, but you don't really have to kind of reading should be for pleasure, and you should enjoy the book. And if at the end of it you do come up with a judgment, pro or con, for or against any one character, that's absolutely fine. I mean, you don't become a criminal just because you kind of you just
understand
the complexity of the character and how his or her mind works, and just.
On a lighter note, let me tell you, you can't be Ted Bundy. You have to be a Ted Bundy, all right? So, and secondly, yes, empathy is important, because civilizations will be judged by the quantum of empathy it shows for its criminals. That's very important. So I cannot take away empathy out of understanding a criminal. It's very important to understand somebody who commits a crime. But whether you should hang your critical judgment or not, that's something, it's your personal choice. That's a choice you have to make for yourself. If something disturbs you and you don't want to read it any further, you don't read it any further. Throw away the book. Campaign to your friends not to read that book. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think, for instance, people who have read my book have actually told me that, we thought something really horrible would happen to Ambarish Dev Parma, who is the villain in the end, and actually nothing happens. And my thing was that, very often, so how often does actually evil go punished? I mean, it keeps recurring and recurring and recurring. So, so people do actually, want evil to be punished, and writers often actually, you do lead the reader in such a way that, they want evil to be punished. So I think in most cases, people, they might actually in the end have some empathy. Okay, he is like this because, he was born bad, he was brought up bad. But I think in the, people do actually, want evil to be punished, and writers themselves, lead the readers to it. So.
Any other question? If not, I will.
Discussion can go on and
Yes. So the takeaways that I have as a reader and as part of this conversation, just hearing, having read their books, having read books in general, is that, of course, and also taking your last question into account, is that there's no doubt of the fascination of evil. I mean, it is seductive. It is the most seductive thing on earth. And we are all on a slider. Each one of us are on a slider. And where judgment comes in, not so much critical, but probably emotional, psychological, like reasoning, our ability to cognitively reason with ourselves, right? That's where all of these judgments and evaluations come in to determine where we will act on that slider. We may be thinking here on the slider. I mean, I may, like I said, just want to murder you, but I'm not going to step that way because my reasoning comes in. And so there is no evaluation without judgment, and we cannot keep the company of fools. So, and to decide whether someone's a fool or not, we do have to evaluate. So can't really keep your judgment aside. But at the end of the day, also, we are the victims of victims. So, in each and every way, if you've been victimized by somebody, there's always some sort of cause somewhere. And empathy is never going to hurt us. But again, that little rule that stops us from stepping into those shoes and committing similar crimes, or worse, or even slightly better. I think that about would be it. Thank you so much for being a very engaged audience, and we can head towards the main venue for Amitav Ghosh's talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.